Because of my admiration for Steiner's intellect and his art, I was reluctant to come around to his critics' view that he was, in his Hitler novel, devising sophisticated ways of blaming the victim. But in fact, in my conversation with him at Cambridge that morning, he took a breathtaking leap even beyond the blame the victim rhetoric of his Hitler novel. He tossed out, almost casually, what might be seen as the ultimate blame the victim argument, the Jews' ontological responsibility for Hitler's crime. It was a line of speculation so shocking, so transgressive, I later found myself wishing I hadn't heard it at all. He introduced it by referring to a startling remark in the final posthumously published interview with Sidney Hook, the celebrated anti-communist philosopher, a remark Hook realized was so inflammatory he insisted it could not be published during his lifetime. It had a tremendous impact on me, Steiner tells me. Dying, Sidney Hook gave Norman Podhoretz an interview, and he believed great philosophers should not be afraid to speak out, but he demanded it be kept posthumous. It says something very important. It says something roughly like this: if we, the Jews, had disappeared, assimilated, wouldn't it have been much better? Hasn't the price been too great? Now, this is a key question, and Hook was afraid to touch on that taboo until after his death, but it's there. He dictates it to Podhoretz. It's controversial enough, but, Steiner says, my question goes even further. I have said Auschwitz does two things. It does everything to the Jew, and it does everything to those who do it to the Jews. And then he delivers the unspeakable implication. The horror of the thing is we have lowered the threshold of mankind. We, as Jews, have? By being the occasion of mankind's ultimate bestiality, he said. We are that which has shown mankind to be ultimately bestial. We refused Jesus, who dies hideously on the cross, and then mankind turns on us in a vulgar kind of counter-Golgotha, which is Auschwitz. And when somebody tortures a child, he does it to the child, he does it to himself, too. Well, true, but who are we to sympathize with? Both equally? Steiner presses on with his extraordinary argument about Jews lowering the threshold of mankind. Auschwitz breaks the reinsurance on human hope, in a sense. Breaks the reinsurance on human hope? I asked. The sense that there is always some kind of safety net, some reason not to give in to utter despair at the evil in the world? Yeah, and without us there wouldn't have been Auschwitz. In a sense, an obscene statement, and yet an accurate statement. Again, I found myself not quite willing to believe that Steiner believed in the implications of what he was saying. It went beyond blaming the victim for giving the perpetrator an excuse, a reason that explained his crime against them. It blamed the victim for even existing in the first place, and thus becoming an occasion for the perpetrator sinking to new levels of depravity or inventing new degrees of evil. And so I questioned him closely about this conjecture. What was it about Auschwitz in the first place that defined it as a quantum leap in the evolution of evil, made it different from previous massacres, in the sense that this one breaks the reinsurance on human hope? What made it different, he says, is its terrible ontological comprehensiveness. There have been many other horrible massacres, he says, and men are cruel and they've tortured. But the ontological difference, the new, darker mode of being that came into being with Auschwitz, has to do with the ontological reason the Jews were killed, not because of their actions, but because of their being. To kill a child because he is, not because he does, not because he believes, not because he belongs to a religion, for his being. That's what the word ontological means. Because you are, you must die. This is not like other pursuits. If you kill a lot of Serbs, it's because you want their territory, etc., etc. Islam converts Jews, doesn't kill them. The idea that the Jew has to be eliminated because he is, that his existential being is inadmissible, the attempt to fulfill that idea probably means that humanity has no road back to certain illusions. No road back. What he's saying has something in common with his speculation on Kafka as the cause of the death camps. By bringing into the world the previously unthinkable idea of such sophisticated bestiality, Kafka might somehow have caused it. Similarly, by being the victim of such previously unimaginable bestiality, the Jews may have caused the bottom to drop out of the world, an unmendable rent in the tenuous fabric of hope suspended over the bottomless abyss of despair. Which is why Steiner invokes Sidney Hook's despairing posthumous question, might the world have been better off if the Jews had stopped being Jews? Hook asks, might the world have been better off if the Jews had never existed at all? Steiner asks. Steiner calls this line of speculation obscene yet accurate. It's certainly obscene. Is it accurate? For one thing, Hook's conjecture is belied by the fact that conversion or assimilation rarely spared Jews the ravages of anti-Semitism. Recently, Benzion Netanyahu demonstrated that in the Spanish Inquisition, hatred and murder of the Jews persisted regardless of their conversion to Christianity. It was racial rather than religious. In fact, especially targeted at the converts and Marranos. So, of course, was Hitler's. In another sense, Steiner's ontological blame the Jews argument contradicts the gravamen of what he, or his Hitler, argues in that notorious speech in the novel. To Steiner's Hitler, Jews weren't exterminated just for being, but for cause. For the torments of conscience they supposedly inflicted on the world, for instance. Just to clarify this point, I asked Steiner about his argument that the Jews were killed because they tortured the conscience of mankind. You seem to be saying that something about the Jews, that this is irrational hatred. No, it is no. Call it, if you want, an intuitive hatred. I believe that explanations for anti-Semitism of a socio-political nature are fine as far as they go, but they tell you nothing about two things. About Jew hatred where there are no Jews, in contemporary Poland, for instance, and about the ontological decision that one must kill the human person because of its being. And hence I put forward this image, this hypothesis that our invention of God, of Jesus, our invention of Marxist utopia, has left humanity so uncertain inwardly that it is trying to banish its own bad conscience. Are you saying, then, that the torture of conscience is worse than the torture in the camps, even? Over the long run, he says, to feel yourself at fault probably builds up unbearable hatreds, self-hatreds, to feel yourself found out. Of course, there are those who believe that what is really going on here is Steiner's self-hatred, Steiner as a self-hating Jew. But I don't think so. I found Steiner deeply identified as a Jew, not anti-Zionist, as he's occasionally been portrayed. In fact, anti-Zionist. But he has even more deeply identified with the Jew as the perennial outsider, with the alienating, self-lacerating self-awareness of Jewish intellect, making the Jew so often an exile not just from a physical homeland, but from metaphysical comfort in the world. He spoke, in fact, of his fondness for the figure of the wandering Jew, and for Jewish wanderers and wanderers from Spinoza to Kafka and Trotsky. But I still found it disturbing how far he was willing to wander into speculation that seemed to make Jews responsible for the ontologic scale, the ontology-shifting and darkening crimes against them. Unless, perhaps, there was in Steiner a willful need to place himself and his people at the ontological center of the universe. It's almost a Steinerian reinvention of the chosen people doctrine he professes to question. the fate of the Jews as the fulcrum, the test case of being. But something else seemed to be going on, something more disturbing, something that may confirm Steiner's distrust of the word, of the uncanny power of Hitler's voice. In attempting a daring act of literary ventriloquism, in attempting to speak with Hitler's voice, to make him mouth Steiner's own ideas about the blackmail of transcendence and so on, a frightening inversion seems to have taken place, one that calls into question who is really pulling the strings, who is the ventriloquist, who the marionette. An inversion that finds a Jewish intellectual talking about the world being better off had the Jews never existed, arriving at the same place, by however different a route, that Hitler did. Another case of the subtle working of the Hitler spell? Still, as the formal interview came to a close, I couldn't help being impressed by Steiner's candor, by his willingness to take personal responsibility for ideas and questions he'd put in Hitler's mouth 15 years previously, by his courage or recklessness in venturing beyond them to even more incendiary territory. While raising the notion of his Hitler as a frightening creation who'd escaped him, he ultimately was standing squarely behind his Hitler, odd as it sounds to say it. Walking back to the Porter's Lodge of Churchill College, Cambridge, Steiner and I returned to the subject of the historical Hitler, in particular his fabled charisma. "I used to ask my students," Steiner said, "if Hitler walked into a room, would you get up?" Would they get up, meaning, would one sit in the presence of world history? And you feel that the presence would be so commanding. But didn't Beryl Bainbridge make him seem to be essentially just a slight, unimpressive figure? I was referring to Bainbridge's challenging novel, Young Adolf, which postulates an apocryphal young Hitler visiting his half-brother Alois Jr. in Liverpool in 1911, during the lost years when he was 22. Bainbridge's brilliantly understated premise in limning a lazy, layabout, slacker Hitler is to raise the question of the unbridgeable abyss between the youthful, inconsequential Hitler and the evil god he became. It raises the eternal question of the source of his metamorphosis. When and how did he acquire his demonic charisma? But you feel that had the young Adolf walked into the room, one would have immediately known? I asked him. Many did, he says. Many did. Speer fell in love with him and never gave up that love. It's interesting how often Speer's love for Hitler is cited as impressive by sophisticated Hitler commentators such as Trevor Roper and Steiner. It's as if to say, if someone as sophisticated as I am could fall under the Hitler spell, then he really must have had something. Wasn't Speer falling in love with the later charismatic Hitler, though? I asked. Goebbels meets him very early, and writes in his diary, "Is he John the Baptist? Is he Jesus?" Yes, but that was still about 1925, I said. We still have him just the unimpressive corporal in the First World War. He's not, Steiner exclaims. He has the Iron Cross twice over, 3 times wounded, oh boy, in the most dangerous of all military functions, namely courier, where the survival rate was about a week, usually like 1 hour. Later on, he's a spotter, an artillery spotter in front of the lines, and he volunteered for this, and his contempt later for general staff officers who haven't been in a fighting war was fully justified. He knew. So Hitler was a genuinely brave man? Immensely. You do not get 3 major wounds and the Iron Cross unless you are. So we can't get off the hook by thinking of him as cowardly, as hypocritical about, oh no. He was heroic and admirable in a way? Up to that point? Well, his record is objectively there for anybody to see. And it's, his military courage, very important for the later politics. I took my leave with mixed feelings. It was similarly hard to doubt Steiner's personal courage in asking explosive questions and giving incendiary answers to them, in venturing beyond the lines of conventional thinking on the subject, speculations that make him vulnerable to hostile fire. And he has been fired upon. His most thoughtful and thoroughgoing critic, Chaim Maccabee, once said of Steiner and the words he put in Hitler's mouth, "He knew he was playing with fire." The implication is that Steiner was being intellectually immature, a child playing with matches, that he was giving in to the seductions of his own brilliance, to the impulse to play with ideas, to push speculations to the limits without caring enough for the consequences in the hands of those less well-intentioned in a world dangerous to Jews. An impulse to play that might not be dangerous in one who lacked Steiner's powerful intellect, but is in him. That, in effect, Steiner is too smart, but not wise enough, for his own good, or ours. But Maccabee himself, as we'll see in the next chapter, is also not averse to playing with fire. Chapter 18. Singling Out Christianity, the Passion Play of Chaim Maccabee, in which a Jewish scholar offers the explanation that dare not speak its name. It's the beginning of holiday season in London. The crowds bustling through the bracing December chill are exhibiting the conventional Dickensian cheer, bearing festive rolls of wrapping paper and ribbon home. But deep in the basement of the Sternberg Library of the Leo Baeck Institute for Jewish Studies, the combative scholar Chaim Maccabee was exhibiting a very different kind of holiday spirit. "People go on about this jolly festival of Christmas," he was saying to me, "but I think Christmas is a sinister festival." Sinister? Because what is it? The sacrifice has been born. Let us rejoice. The Christian doesn't think about Easter now, but somewhere in the back of his mind, Christmas is leading him to Easter. In the back of everybody's mind is, why are we celebrating this birth with such joy? We are garlanding the sacrifice, because he's due for a horrific death. A horrific death the Jews will pay for, have paid for. To Maccabee, the dark truth behind the cheer, the skull beneath the skin of the holiday spirit, is the responsibility Christianity, even Christmas, bears for the horrific death of the Jews. Christians say the Holocaust is part of the evil of humanity, Maccabee remarked to me later in our conversation. It isn't the evil of humanity, it's the evil of Christendom. And Hitler? He embodied a certain aspect of Christian civilization which in other people is diffused, he told me later on in our conversation, when he spoke of Hitler as the boil in which the poisons of Christian society came to a head. This is extremely strong stuff, another example of how attempts to explain Hitler drive the most mild-mannered and scholarly types, like Maccabee, to rhetorical and philosophical extremes. Sitting behind his desk in the book-lined office set in the corner of the library stacks, Maccabee has the demeanor of a retired clerk, but his words carry the fiery conviction of the warrior priests, the Maccabees, whose name he bears. Maccabees is not the emotional partisanship of a religious fanatic. An Oxford-educated literature scholar turned historian of religion, his serious convictions arise from a lifetime of study and scrupulous research. He is, he believes, merely expressing painfully uncomfortable truths that other Jews refrain from expressing for fear of offending the primarily Christian society in which they live. But for Maccabee, the Hitler explanation that dare not speak its name must be expressed. The Christian roots of genocide must be exposed. When Maccabee says, "Christmas is a sinister festival," he's not saying, "Bah humbug." He's saying, in effect, "Bah Holocaust." To some extent, the dispute between George Steiner and Chaim Maccabee conjures up the great disputations of medieval Europe. Those disputations were, in fact, terrible inquisitional torments inflicted on Jews in the guise of theological debates. The disputations could be seen as the intellectual crucifixion of Jewish faith. A prominent figure of Jewish learning or rabbinic scholarship would be compelled, often dragged, to the cathedral to take part in a debate with a leading Christian theologian over the crude proposition, which religion has the truth, Judaism or Christianity? Needless to say, the fight was fixed, the judging rigged, the Jews subjected to catcalls and verbal and physical abuse while trying to maintain with dignity beliefs they had no wish to subject to debate, often against converted, renegade Jews who claimed to know insidious and shameful fallacies and secret distortions in Jewish doctrine. Maccabee himself has written a play based on one of the most famous of these, The Disputation, a play one Jewish critic described as a Jewish passion play. While the conflict between Steiner and Maccabee has some elements of the grand medieval disputations, it's more a battle of equals, both brilliant and impassioned partisans. But ultimately, the crux of the debate comes down to the stark choice of Judaism versus Christianity. Which is more to blame for Hitler? Steiner finally blames Judaism's blackmail of transcendence for making the Jews an object of murderous hatred. Maccabee blames what he believes is the blood hate at the heart of the Christian Gospels for sanctioning, preparing the ground for, what in his view amounts to the Christian ritual murder of the Jewish people. For Maccabee, a trim, distinguished-looking man who was close to 70 when I saw him, this has become a deeply ingrained article of faith, but one he insists is the product of reason, years of painful immersion in the history of the Christian-Jewish relationship. The executive director of the Sternberg Library in the Leo Baeck Institute, a distinguished London center for the study of German Jewish culture, Maccabee is the author of half a dozen scholarly books, but he's most well known in America through his combative polemics in Commentary, which challenge Jews to cut through the warm fog of ecumenical hopes and cast a cold eye on the responsibility of Christian culture and Christian belief for the Holocaust. For someone with Maccabee's views on the responsibility of Christianity, George Steiner's elaborate speculations about the responsibilities of Judaism are not merely misguided, they are patently offensive. He goes so far as to accuse Steiner of glorifying Hitler by giving him that final unrefuted speech of blame the Jews' self-justification in the Portage to San Cristobal of A.H. Maccabee's tone in speaking of Steiner ranges from the acidulous. He does not consider him a charlatan, although he implies others do, to the contemptuous. He accuses Steiner of playing with fire in giving Hitler's incendiary speech such rhetorical power. He makes it sound as if Steiner were an irresponsible child playing with matches. But there is a sense in which Maccabee himself can be seen as playing with fire, burning bridges, the fragile bridges of ecumenicism that link Christians and Jews in the aftermath of the Holocaust, by insisting Christianity is irremediably infected with a murderously evil hatred in its very essence. When I raised the question, Maccabee's response was, "Forget ecumenicism. One can't be ecumenical with a faith whose essence is sanctioned hatred of Jews." Maccabee knows that what he's doing is breaking a taboo, that pronouncing aloud the explanation that dare not speak its name can be as troubling to Jews as it is to Christians. He'd first advanced the notion that Christianity, not just some Christians, must bear responsibility for the Holocaust, that it was not an aberration of Christian principles, but a culmination of some malevolent essence, in a piece in Commentary that created an uproar on the Jewish magazine's letters page. "Your position was attacked almost as if it were a breach of decorum, of an unspoken rule that Jews have to be nice about not saying such things? I suggested. Oh, very much so, he said. You could see the extent to which what I said horrified many people, Jews as well as Christians. But I felt that people were concerning themselves so much with Jewish-Christian relations, they were sweeping things under the carpet which needed to be talked about. All these people will say, yes, there have been Christians that have been anti-Semites, and it's unfortunate that it spread among the people as a kind of misconception of Christianity, but it was never really the true meaning of Christianity. It was never shared by the leaders of Christianity. And my argument was just the contrary, that people remained for centuries unaffected by anti-Semitism. It took the indoctrination by the leaders over the entire course of 18 centuries to make the people anti-Semitic enough to accept Hitler. Maccabee is not anti-Christian per se. He speaks well of certain variants that don't emphasize the human sacrifice of the crucifixion, as he calls it, and the concomitant need to scourge the Jews as the sacred executioners of God. But he does believe that the impulse to hate and to murder Jews, the impulse that Hitler tapped into, is not an aberration but an essence of mainstream Christianity. It is a straight line, a direct connection, Maccabee believes, between Judas and Hitler. Between the hate-filled portrait of a treacherous betrayer of the Lord, who became the archetypal Jew in Christian consciousness for 18 centuries, and the culmination of that indoctrination in Jew hatred, the readiness of Christian nations, Christian people, to become complicit in the murder of the Judas people when incited and empowered to by Hitler. Perhaps, considering his preoccupation with Judas, it should not come as a surprise that betrayal is a recurrent theme of Maccabee's discourse. One senses that part of his anger at George Steiner derives from his feeling that Steiner, like one of those medieval disputationist Jews who argued the Christian side, has betrayed his own people, become a Judas to the Jews, in the service of his intellectual vanity. And Maccabee's account of the evolution of his own personal antagonism to Christianity began with what he describes as a personal betrayal, his betrayal by T.S. Eliot. I come to the whole subject as a British Jew rather than, let's say, someone personally involved in the Holocaust, Maccabee told me. My family are all part of that Russian Jewry which moved to Western Europe and America as a result of the turn-of-the-century pogroms. It's very possible that some of my family were lost in the Holocaust, but I don't know because we lost touch with our Russian relatives. He was, however, personally involved in the war against Hitler. I served in the British Army, but that's the extent of my involvement. He was too young to see combat before the war ended. He speaks of the underestimation syndrome in Britain in the pre-war era of his childhood, which wanted to regard Hitler as a normal kind of politician who might have been extreme in one way or another, but as time went on, rational considerations would take over. I mean, people even are talking on those lines today. There's John Charmley now, the author of a recent biography of Winston Churchill that argues that he was too fanatically obsessed with Hitler and that the British might have been better off making a peace of equals with Hitler in 1940 or 1941. I think that's all wrong. I mean, people just didn't understand how extreme Hitler was and how mad he was. He speaks of his own first intimations of that in his first year at Oxford in 1942. When I was a student at Balliol College, people were beginning to hand round pictures, evidence of what was going on in Hitler's death camps. And there were 1 or 2 big meetings held at various parks in London and in Oxford to make people aware of what was going on. But people weren't aware. The general public was not aware. His own awareness had not yet begun to affect his cultural preoccupation. He'd embraced the Western canon at the roots, the fount of Balliol. I studied classics at Oxford. that is, Latin and Greek. And then I went on to study philosophy, and in the end, English literature became my main study. As much as he embraced Western literature and Western culture, he could not help but begin to feel a growing disturbance at one aspect of it. I think the first time I encountered that was in the writings of G.K. Chesterton, which I got very interested in when I was a teenager. I loved his writing, but then there was the streak of anti-Semitism running through it. And also Hilaire Belloc. His writing was even worse. Something about the difference between Belloc's and Chesterton's anti-Semitism made Chesterton seem somehow more sinister to Maccabee. With Chesterton, it didn't seem to come too naturally to him. He seemed to pick it up from his religious belief, rather than from the kind of inbred anti-Semitism that Belloc's was. I became interested in the relationship between Christian doctrine and anti-Semitism. I'd always been interested because I was brought up in a very rabbinical family. My father's father was, and my uncle was, a serious student of the Talmud. So I was brought up in the study of Judaism at its most scholarly, and I read quite deeply in the history of Christianity in my early years, and I came back to it after I started getting deeply into the study of English literature, because the author whom I was particularly interested in, whom I wrote many articles and did research on, was T.S. Eliot. And here we're back to the same syndrome of Christianity, an author whom I admired as a writer, and who, at the same time, seemed to have anti-Semitism not just as something peripheral to his writing, but one that seemed to go right to the depth of his personality and the heart of his beliefs as a Christian. To his dismay, Maccabee came to feel that it was the kind of writer who felt his Christianity most deeply, writers such as Chesterton and Eliot, who were more likely to feel impelled to disparage Jews and Judaism. And, Maccabee came to believe, in doing so they weren't necessarily misunderstanding Christianity. They might have been understanding the anti-Semitic impulse within it all too well. It's an impulse Maccabee believes emanates from, above all else, the Judas story in the Gospels, the identification of Judas as the archetypal Jew, and the incitement to hatred in his portrayal. While Judas isn't singled out for his Jewishness in the New Testament, all the disciples were at least nominally Jewish. The identification was made official by papal pronouncement as early as the 5th century, when Pope Gelasius I denounced Judas as a devil and the devil's workman who gives his name to the whole race of Jews. Unofficially, elements of the Judas story in the Gospels have lent themselves, or helped create, the most pernicious stereotypes of the Jew. His treachery was mercenary. He sold Jesus to the authorities for 30 pieces of silver. He was a greedy embezzler. In the Gospel of John, he's filching from the disciples' funds for the poor. And, above all, he is a dishonest, deceitful traitor, a smiling villain who kisses Jesus on the mouth while stabbing him in the back. Indeed, one can hear incendiary anti-Semitic echoes of the Judas story in the stab-in-the-back accusation Hitler manipulated to convince the German public that the heroic German army had not lost the First World War, but had been betrayed, stabbed in the back, by treacherous Jews and Jewish-paid politicians on the home front. Judasness is central to the vision of Jewishness in Hitler's rhetoric. In his focus on the Judas story, Maccabee differs from much of the previous discussion of the sources of Christian anti-Semitism, which has tended to focus more on the early anti-Judaizing shift in Christianity's self-definition, from a faith that saw itself fulfilling the promises of Judaism to a faith that superseded its Jewish origins. The focus of this school of thought is less on Judas than on the powerful anti-Judaizing supersessionist ideology of Paul, the Jewish persecutor of Christians who became the Christian purger of Jewishness from Christianity. Some see Paul's doctrinal predisposition as sanctioning popular rage against Jews for denying and crucifying Jesus. Maccabee emphatically disagrees. While there are anti-Jewish elements in Paul's doctrine and in the rhetoric of the Pauline epistles, my main point is that it's not so much a question of doctrine, it's a question of the imaginative image that is produced by the Judas story itself. There's no credo in Christianity saying you have to be anti-Semites. The figure of Judas plays no part in the Christian creed, but in the Christian story it plays a very important part, because he personifies the figure of the Jews. I was somewhat skeptical of Maccabee's position initially. Having recently reread the Pauline epistles, I'd been shocked at the kind of insidious, incendiary incitements Paul uses against the Jews in certain of them. But I made a point, after speaking with Maccabee, to look again at the Judas passages in the New Testament. In part, their anti-Semitic potential derives from the fact that Judas is not the abstract people that Paul rails against, but a vividly embodied flesh and blood Jew, one Christians had not only heard of and read about, but had actually seen, the sneaking, despicable betrayer familiar to centuries and centuries of Christian audiences, the Jew in the Passion Play. What struck me also in reading the Gospel accounts of Judas is the exterminationist imperative embedded at the very heart of the story, in the words, the curse, of Jesus himself. Knowing at the Last Supper that Judas has already betrayed him, Jesus issues this curse: "Woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed! It would have been better for that man if he had never been born." Emphasis added. A curse that struck me more forcefully for having recently heard George Steiner speculate that it might have been better if the Jewish people had disappeared or never existed, had never been born. It is virtually a wish for retroactive extermination, which in Maccabee's thesis paved the way for Hitler's proactive extermination. Perhaps the emotional power of the Judas story has something to do with its pervasive rhetoric of blood. The 30 pieces of silver Judas has taken from the temple authorities to betray Jesus becomes blood money. When a cravenly remorseful Judas slinks back to the temple to try to return it to his paymasters, even they reject it because it's tainted with blood. Those cursed silver coins are used by the temple authorities to buy a field that later becomes known as the Field of Blood, a place that becomes, in another variant of the story, the place where Judas meets his bloody end. It's a field he bought with his blood money, and while surveying his purchase, he suffers a violent fall, a plunge that resulted in his intestines bursting out of his body, bathing the ground in blood, turning it into a field of blood in fact as well as name. The pervasiveness of blood in the Judas story finds its reflection, Maccabee believes, in the pervasiveness of blood in the most incendiary and murderous of anti-Semitic legends, the so-called blood libel, the persistent legend that Jews practice the ritual murder of Christian children, a kind of recapitulation of the crucifixion, in order to obtain blood for use in Passover rituals. To Maccabee, the repetition of the Judas story, centuries and centuries of Christian children being indoctrinated with that primal tale of mercenary Jewish blood money betrayal, had, by the time of the Holocaust, cumulatively built up a profound and deeply embedded thirst for Jewish blood, a vengeful thirst once satisfied by periodic pogroms, but easily manipulated by Hitler into complicity with extermination. I asked Maccabee if there was, in the story of the Field of Blood the Jew soaking the landscape, an anticipation of or sanction for the fields of blood that Hitler's camps became. It is the story, yes. People are much more affected by a story than they are by theology or creeds. And children who are taught a story in which from the earliest years the Jew is the hateful figure, Judas Iscariot and the Jews generally are hateful figures, will hate Jews from then onwards without even knowing why they hate the Jews. And if they lose their Christian belief, that hate will still remain with them. they'll find some other reason for hating Jews. Like Hitler himself, for example. You feel the Judas story was directly responsible for Hitler's anti-Semitism? I asked Maccabee. He emphasizes that in 2 of the Gospel accounts of Judas's betrayal, he is entered by Satan, Luke, or taken possession by the devil, John, before he betrays Jesus, forever inscribing an image of the Jews as the people of the devil on the hearts of children who hear the story in a state of primal receptivity. Hitler was brought up to hate the Jews, particularly to hate the Jews as the people of the devil, he insists. He lost his Christian faith, but he retained the hatred of the Jews as the people of the devil. Maccabee is here deliberately undercutting the argument of those who attempt to exempt or exculpate Christianity as a source of Hitler's Jew hatred by citing various anti-Christian remarks Hitler made over the years. A recent instance of this can be found in a newspaper column by Pat Buchanan. In attempting to repudiate Jesse Jackson's inflammatory remark that a Christian coalition in Nazi Germany provided a suitable scientific theologic rationale for Hitler, Buchanan declared, "Hitler loathed Christianity. In Louis Snyder's Hitler's Third Reich, a documentary history, Hitler is quoted as saying, 'Antiquity was better than modern times because it didn't know Christianity and syphilis.'" Of course, Hitler was all over the map with his pontifications on Christianity, often attacking it as Judaism under another name, but just as often uttering pieties about the importance of the Church to national morality. Maccabee's point is that however many anti-Christian quotes from Hitler you find, they come from the adult Hitler. The true relevance of the anti-Jewish animus of Christianity to Hitler's psyche was its effect on Hitler's impressionable imagination as a child, that the emotional indoctrination of the Judas story was a powerful, poisonous legacy that ran deeper than any later disagreements Hitler might have over the political and social role of the Christian Church in Germany. In the ongoing controversy over the origin of Hitler's anti-Semitism and the cause of its virulence, then, Maccabee seems to be envisioning a far earlier starting point than most. "Are you saying it began at the Benedictine monastery, then?" I asked him, referring to Hitler's early schooling in the Benedictine friars' school at Lambach. "Yeah, well, you may say lots of people who received similar education didn't turn into Hitlers, but it was certainly that, combined, of course, with a particularly obsessive personality, which made this the center of his thinking. I'm quite sure that his personal upbringing had a great deal to do with it. If he hadn't had a Christian upbringing, he would have been probably a sick personality anyhow, but his sickness would have fastened onto some other kind of hatred. But having had that Christian upbringing, his sick personality centered on the traditional enemy. And particularly in the circumstances of the defeat of Germany, there is the need for a scapegoat, the tendency of people to turn to the traditional scapegoat in times of great distress. I asked Maccabee what his reaction was to Hitler's own account in Mein Kampf of a later transformative moment in his perception of Jews. That moment in the Vienna street some 10 years later than Lambach, when he first glimpsed a Jew in alien-seeming black caftan and black earlocks. "Well, he's kidding himself, I think," Maccabee says, "or kidding us. Hitler has an interest in portraying anti-Semitism as something he developed rather than grew up with. I think he saw this figure, but why was he filled with such hatred for this figure? I mean, if it had been Amish, for example, and also dressed in rather unfamiliar black garb, he wouldn't have felt a sense of hatred at all." I mentioned to Maccabee a doctoral thesis I'd seen, by Helmut Schmeller, that argued that, growing up in Linz, Hitler was most likely reading the extremely anti-Semitic newspaper, the Linzer Fliegende Blätter, which would suggest an anti-Semitic awareness of oft-caricatured black caftaned Jews, long before the alleged revelatory encounter with that apocryphal wandering Jew in the streets of Vienna. So he's lying about that. Or at the very least, this was something that probably went back so early in his life he can't remember when it started. And what about all the millions of Christians indoctrinated in the same way who didn't become Hitler? I asked. He was very unique in a way, in the sense that he embodied a certain aspect of Christian civilization, which in other people is diffused and has many other things to counterbalance it. But he struck a chord with that aspect in others. He was himself a human being who contained that chord. He embodied it single-mindedly. He was the focal point of a kind of evil which grew to a head like a boil in him. It was that common chord that united the German people with Hitler in their partnership in genocide, he believes. The criticism of your point of view, I said to Maccabee, has been that Hitler's was a racial, not a Christian, anti-Semitism. The criticism of your point of view, I said to Maccabee, has been that Hitler's was a racial, not a Christian, anti-Semitism. Am I right in thinking that what you're saying is that racial anti-Semitism, as the Nazis and Hitler formulated it, was something that had been around for maybe a century? But there were 18 centuries of Christian... Right, absolutely. The point is, you see, that you build up a fund of hatred against a certain group of people. The fact that that fund is backed by certain dogmas doesn't mean that when those dogmas left, the hatred's left. The hatred's still there. And it has to be backed up by newer theories. I mean, if the Jews are no longer hated because they are the people of Satan who killed Jesus, then some other theory works. In the case of the Nazis, it was a racial theory. With Karl Marx, the Jews played the role of the archetypal capitalist. This is what I call post-Christian anti-Semitism. A continuation of Christian anti-Semitism in a different guise, as opposed to Daniel Goldhagen's concept of eliminationist anti-Semitism, for instance, which Goldhagen defines against Christian anti-Semitism. For Maccabee, it all comes back to the Gospels, to the emotional power of the blood curse. The Gospels really worked up this picture of the Jews as murderous deicides. In fact, I came to think that in Maccabee's insistent emphasis on the emotional power of the blood curse and the blood rhetoric of the Gospels, he was doing something very powerful and emotional. He was reversing the poles of the notorious blood libel, so long and so murderously leveled at Jews, to say, "We are not guilty of the bloodthirsty ritual murder of Christian children we've been accused of, but you Christians are guilty of, accomplices to, paved the way for, the ritual murder of the Jews. Our blood is on your hands." In his book on the Judas question, The Sacred Executioner, Human Sacrifice and the Legacy of Guilt, Maccabee offered an anthropological analysis of the way the crucifixion is transformed into the ritual murder of the Jews. "Jews are killed because of Christian guilt," he wrote. "Guilt for their, the Christians, need for a human sacrifice to make their salvation possible, the sacrifice of Jesus to atone for their sins. The fact that the powers of evil, the Jews, bring about the necessary redemptive death of the sacrifice doesn't excuse the Jews in any way," he told me. "They're still hated. In fact, the more you hate them, the more you are saved yourself, because you therefore can wash your hands like Pilate, and you are no longer implicated in the death of Jesus, which was done for your sake, for your sins. You benefit by the death of Jesus because you're saved, but you have no part in the death. Guilt for it is displaced to the Jews, who can then be killed with impunity." Jews are, in Maccabee's interpretation, dragged into the gospel story to perform a function, killing the necessary sacrifice, and then are themselves slaughtered to absolve the guilt of those who really benefited from the killing of Christ, the Christians. The blood is really on Christian hands, Maccabee believes. They're the ones guilty of the ritual murder. Frankly, I'm not sure Maccabee's psychoanthropological analysis is necessary or adds anything to his Judas-based case against Christianity. But he's attached to it as he's attached to that case. Maccabee isn't unaware of how transgressive, indeed offensive, this analysis will sound to devout Christians. He's thought about the consequences of what comes close to indicting Christianity for Hitler's murder of the Jews, but he believes it has to be said. Christians have to be confronted with what he sees as the hatred at the heart of the Gospels. He also knows that his insistence on this is disturbing, even offensive, to many Jews. He talks about a 1989 clash at a symposium at New York City's University Graduate Center with the American Jewish ecumenicist Rabbi Mark Tannenbaum. He was very much against my whole line of approach. He was involved in Jewish-Christian relations in a very big way, and he was involved particularly with talks with the Pope to try to get the Vatican to recognize Israel, and he felt that this line that I was adopting was counterproductive. But I reject that line of thought, he continued. It's what I call pusillanimous. Here we Jews are, for the first time for many centuries, we're able to speak out. Before, we couldn't speak out because we're going to get killed if we speak out. Now, supposedly, we mustn't speak out because it's bad taste to speak out. One way or another, there's some gag on us. I said, if we don't speak out now, when are we going to speak out? We can't speak out in time of persecution because we'll be persecuted. But in times when we're not being persecuted, we mustn't speak out because that would show lack of gratitude to people for not persecuting us? So when do we speak out? Never? On the other hand, I suggest, your view is fairly bleak in the sense that it doesn't hold out any ecumenical hope of some reconciliation between Jews and Christianity, because you're saying at the very heart of Christianity is the sanctioned hatred and murder of Jews. Well, as I always say to people who say you're calling for the end of Christianity in the sense that it depends on the ritual murder of Jews, I say, no, I don't think so. I'm supporting a certain strand in Christianity against official Christianity. I'm saying that throughout the centuries there have been Christians who have actually protested against Christianity. People like Pelagius, who protested against Augustine. People who believed in the humanity of Jesus, not in the divinity of Jesus. Who didn't want to think of the death of Jesus as being a sacrifice, a theological sacrifice, but simply the martyrdom of a great man in the cause of freedom. He was fighting against Rome, not against the Jews. People who think of Jesus as a model teacher. And Jesus would be in the same position then in Christianity that Moses is in Judaism, as Muhammad is in Islam, a human teacher. There's nothing anti-religious in this. It's not a position then that Christianity, if it were self-aware, has to abolish itself. It's more that there is a kind of Christianity that does not have implicit in it hatred of the Jews. Right. In other words, that instead of concentrating on Jesus' death, they would concentrate on Jesus' life. It is, however, a Christianity that would be recognized as such by only a small percentage of those calling themselves Christians, mainly Unitarians and the like. In response, Maccabee points out that there are some post-Holocaust Christian theologians, such as Rosemary Ruther, who tend to agree with him, who feel so troubled by the implication of Christian anti-Semitism in paving the way for the Holocaust that they have begun to call for mainstream Christianity to re-evaluate or revise its core beliefs to exercise anti-Jewish animus. I wondered if he was also referring to the strand of post-Holocaust German Christian theologians who have attempted to incorporate the Holocaust into the gospel story of the crucifixion by positing that the Jews of Europe were in some way on the cross, that they were the victims of the crucifixion, the true body of Christ in some mystical, atemporal way. He rejects it as pernicious. I object very strongly to that kind of Christianization of the Holocaust by which the Jews become a kind of Christ figure suffering for the Christians' sins. He sees a tricky theological rationalization going on here, which still reifies or recuperates the notion of a sacrificial crucifixion by a sacred executioner. Here Hitler assumes the role of Jewish crucifier, driving the nails into the body of the Jewish people. It ends up, in effect, renewing the crucifixion story with fresh blood, so to speak, and blaming the Jews in a more sophisticated way, Maccabee says. Blaming the Jews in a more sophisticated way. This is exactly what Maccabee believes George Steiner is doing. Of all the attacks on Steiner following the publication of his Hitler novel, Maccabee's, which appeared in Encounter, was the most thoroughgoing, cut closest to the bone, and was the one Steiner's allies have gone to the greatest lengths to refute. In part because Maccabee knows Steiner's work all too well, knew the sources of Hitler's speech in Steiner's earlier work, could cite the way Hitler in Steiner's novel becomes a full-blown Steinerian, expressing views taken word for word from Steiner's other writings. Maccabee's verdict is also the most severe, going so far as to characterize Steiner's novel as a misleading piece of anti-Jewish propaganda of a regrettably contemporary kind, which may prove of aid and comfort to anti-Semites for years to come. He accuses Steiner of not merely giving Hitler as a person a cosmic dignity, but serving to dignify Hitler by elevating him into a metaphysical principle. Part of Maccabee's animus seems to stem from the fact he is reacting not only to the publication of the novel, but to the 1981 stage production of the novel at London's Mermaid Theatre, the production staged by Christopher Hampton, the one with the Hitler who scared the hell out of Steiner himself. But Maccabee's attack was on more than the speech of Steiner's Hitler character. It was on Steiner's whole oeuvre, on Steiner's character, for what he called a colossal miscalculation produced by intellectual vanity. I wondered, after an attack like that, if the two had ever met and confronted each other. "Well, I do come across him sometimes," he said. "I don't see a lot of George Steiner, but I do from time to time. We don't really see eye to eye very much," he says with seeming mildness, before taking a rather sly swipe at him. "I've never come to criticize him in the way some people have, and call him a charlatan and so on. I admire some of his work, but I do think when he gets into Jewish topics, he falls into a trap." Falls into several traps, according to Maccabee. But before moving on to them, let us take note of the acidulous "I've never called him a charlatan" remark, which has the effect of propagating the idea that the charlatan notion is widespread, while distancing himself from such an uncharitable view in the guise of generosity toward his foe. Although I suspect it's a view Maccabee really does share. The primal trap Steiner falls into, both personally and in his Hitler novel, Maccabee tells me, involves not so much his image of Hitler, but his image of Jews. He falls into a trap, which is to think of the archetype of the Jew being the wandering Jew. And, in fact, just a few days before, Steiner had spoken to me in a very heartfelt way of his identification with the wandering Jew, with Jews who wandered, outcasts and dissidents such as Freud and Leon Trotsky. Trotsky, in particular, the inventor of a system cast out by the monster state he helped create, another kind of Frankenstein story, forced to become the haunted, controversial provocateur in exile. But there is a profound problem, Maccabee believes, in Steiner's, in any Jew's, identification with the wandering Jew. The wandering Jew is not a Jewish image, but a Christian image. He's referring to the origin of the wandering Jew legend in Christian Apocrypha as the story of an encounter between Jesus and a Jew on the streets of first-century Jerusalem. Jesus, dragging his cross, bleeding from his crown of thorns, about to be crucified, asks the Jew for something for his thirst. The Jew rejects him, and as a punishment is condemned to wander the world, forever after an outcast, condemned to a living eternity of remorse. Later, in legends and novels, the wandering Jew becomes a more ambiguous, even heroic figure. But at the core, it is, Maccabee insists, a Christian image of an ideal kind of Jew. A Jew who acknowledges his guilt over rejecting Christ and implicitly acknowledges the justness of the persecutions inflicted on him by Christians. It's saying that Christians would like Jews to accept the role of the people who brought about the death of Jesus, the role of murderer, in effect, and to do so in a spirit of repentance, acceptance even of the punishments inflicted upon them, up to and including the final solution. Maccabee didn't go on to make the connection between the wandering Jew's acceptance of his implication in his fate and Steiner's apparent argument for the Jews' implication in their genocide in his Hitler novel. I'd argue that Steiner's image of the wandering Jew owed much more to the modern intellectual's preference to be seen as the alienated outsider, and to existentialist philosophy's elevation of guilt into something not to be ashamed of, but rather something to aspire to, as a higher, more acute and authentic form of consciousness in a fallen world. But Maccabee might be on to something, in the sense that Steiner may have fewer qualms about imputing guilt to the Jews for the Holocaust, because this guilt gives the Jews a tragic, ironic chosenness Steiner seems to relish, as much as he rejects the conventional, triumphalist concept of the chosen people. Steiner's ideas about the triumphalist character of the chosen people concept constitute another trap Maccabee believes Steiner's fallen into. I told Maccabee about my conversation with Steiner, in which Steiner had steadfastly, repeatedly insisted that the questions he raised in his fictive Hitler's speech are questions he thought were valid, questions he wanted answers to. The question, for instance, about whether Hitler's racist doctrines were a hungry imitation of the alleged racism of the chosen people idea in Judaism. Actually, the doctrine of the chosen race is fundamentally different from a racialist doctrine. Maccabee says, "The Jews don't say we are the chosen race because we are inherently better than other people, because of some racist characteristics. On the contrary, what is said is that the Jewish people were chosen not for any qualities that they had, but because of the mission, that it was given that the Jews actually come up short all the time. The whole story is about the defects of this people. The whole story is about the backslidings, and it's not a glorification of the Jews at all. It's a story of how they failed on the whole to live up to the mission entrusted to them. It was the story of a failure. And you can't imagine Hitler talking about the failings of the Nordic race. On the contrary, the only failures are not their fault, but the fault of traitors who are plotting against them. Whereas Jews came to be evil in the sight of the Lord. Most people turned away from God and had to be upbraided by the prophets. So it's entirely different from a racist concept. It's the story of a totally degraded people, a slave people who were chosen to develop a concept of freedom. The idea of election is at opposite poles from being a superior race. Opposite poles from being a superior race, perhaps, but still chosen in the sense of chosen to develop a concept of freedom. This might often have been a freedom to fail, a freedom to choose wrong, but a freedom, a power to choose that was especially important to God, even if as an object of his wrath. Maccabee might be strictly right in rejecting the notion that chosenness represents superiority in the sense of intellect, beauty, or nobility, the kinds of claims made for the Nordic race by Hitler, but it does reflect a perhaps even more special moral significance or responsibility. There are two better arguments against Steiner's position than the one Maccabee advances. First, all religions have ways of conferring upon some of their initiates some sense of superiority over the rest of mankind. The elect and saved in some versions of Christianity, the enlightened of Buddhism, the Brahmins of Hinduism, the man who has made the pilgrimage to Mecca in Islam. To single out this aspect of Jewish belief as somehow implicating Jews in their own murder is uncalled for. Another argument against Steiner, or Steiner's Hitler, is that there is little evidence that Hitler did adapt his doctrine of Aryan superiority from the chosen people concept of the Jews. In fact, there is more evidence that he adapted it from an abundance of tracts and treatises available to him on the mystical superiority of the Aryan race, ones that range from the semi-pornographic Ostara magazine in Vienna to the multi-volume scholarly works of Wagner's scientific race guru, Houston Stewart Chamberlain. Maccabee is more persuasive, I believe, in his attack on the assertion Steiner puts in the mouth of his Hitler, that the source of the success of Hitler's anti-Jewish crusade was the threefold blackmail of transcendence: the invention of conscience by Moses, the impossible injunction to perfect love by Jesus, the impossible injunction to perfect justice by Marx. I disagree with this whole idea of his, Steiner's, that Judaism differs from other religions in that it sets a high moral standard which is so impossible that people have to resent it. This is a theory about anti-Semitism, that anti-Semitism consists of the resentment of Christians being forced to live up to the Judaic standard of morality. I don't think that's the case. I think, on the contrary, what is resented in Judaism is people saying morality is possible, that it's not all that hard, and therefore all the excuses people make for avoiding morality don't work. Because what the Bible says is it's not in the heavens, it's not beyond the seas, it is there before you. Morality is easy. The only thing that makes it difficult are all the excuses people make. One of those excuses is to say that morality is so difficult that the only virtue is total humility, that we cannot possibly be good people, so therefore we need a Savior to come from heaven in order to suffer death on our behalf. So what's resented is not the difficulty of Jewish morality, but more a notion that morality is a possibility. It was strange, the week I spent going from Steiner to Maccabee. Both brilliant, impassioned intellects, both utterly at odds, both playing with fire. While Maccabee clearly regards Steiner as having done something dangerous in giving birth to an intellectual rationale for Hitler that blames his victims, Maccabee might, in fact, be doing something equally dangerous, telling the overwhelmingly dominant Christian majority within which diaspora Jews live that its faith bears within it, inextricably entangled at its very heart, the murderous evil seeds of genocide, and that to truly exorcise the guilt of their faith, they must radically transform it or abandon it. They're both playing with fire with their Hitler explanations, but they both also, in very different ways, could be seen as absolving Hitler of responsibility for the Holocaust. They're both shifting the focus from Hitler himself to abstract ideological and anthropological forces of which Hitler is at most a pawn, a boil, a mouthpiece. In Steiner's view, Hitler merely serves and exploits the widespread animus against Jews for the torments of conscience they invented. In Maccabee's view, it was not Hitler so much as Judas, not the real Judas, but the hateful Christian representation of Judas as archetypal Jew, who is responsible for the slaughter of the Jewish people. The image of Judas made Hitler's crimes possible, fertilized the field of blood Hitler harvested. Hitler was merely the catalyst for the inevitable crystallization of Christian hatred. And the other thing that Steiner and Maccabee might seem to do is to remove, if not completely exculpate, Germany from explaining Hitler. While Steiner mused about some potential for violence in the German language, he was emphatic about it being just Germany's bad luck that Hitler came along with his peculiar genius, because, Steiner believed, France would have been more naturally receptive, more anti-Semitic at the core than Germany, and the German culture of Goethe and Heidegger, which Steiner still cherishes despite his distrust. Maccabee's exemption of Germany, or at least of German culture, is even more heartfelt. At the close of our conversation, as Maccabee was gathering his papers to hurry off to a lecture he was to deliver, I raised a question I'd hesitated to ask because I sensed it might be troubling, if not offensive. A question about Leo Baeck, the tragic luminary of the German Jewish community, the Berlin rabbi Maccabee's Institute is named after. It was a question raised by Richard Rubinstein, the American rabbi and one of the most outspokenly heretical of post-Holocaust Jewish theologians. Rubinstein had argued that Jews must hold God to account, if not to blame, for the Holocaust, that to worship him without questioning his silence and passivity in the face of the death camps is virtually an insult to the Jewish victims. Rubinstein has also raised questions about the silence and passivity of some leaders of the German Jewish community in the 30s, who, trusting in God, urged Jews to go about business as usual despite the fate being prepared for them. Rubinstein singled out Rabbi Leo Baeck, the revered leader of the sophisticated, cosmopolitan, assimilated Berlin Jewish community, for Beck's final act before he was dragged off to Theresienstadt concentration camp in the final evacuation of German Jews in 1942. What stunned Rubinstein was an apparently trivial gesture Beck made in the moments before he went off with the SS. He paid his electric bill. Think about it, Rubinstein says. He's joining the rest of the Jews in death camps run by the Nazi regime, but he pays his electric bill to that regime before he leaves. For Rubinstein, I said to Maccabee, this emblematizes Jewish passivity in the face of the Holocaust. What's your response to that? I was surprised at the eloquence and the direction of his reply. What he, Rubinstein, wants Beck to do is to be a kind of token rebel against the whole system, Maccabee told me. The point of Beck's act is that Jews are always expecting decency from people around them. That's our trouble, really. This is really why so many Jews failed to leave Germany. They really couldn't believe that this Germany, which they loved, felt obligations toward. Professionals, for instance, felt gratitude toward Germany for giving them more opportunity for advancement and fulfillment than any other European country. And they wanted nothing more than to express this gratitude by being good citizens. At that point, an assistant came in and whispered something in Maccabee's ear, probably about his being late for his lecture. Yes, we've just finished, he said. But he had something more he wanted to add, something about Beck and his electric bill. I'd say that Leo Baeck never lost that feeling of love for Germany, that sense of obligation toward Germany, as a place to which he had obligations, and he expressed that by acting as an obedient citizen as far as he possibly could, even at the time when Germany was taken over by someone who he felt to be against the whole spirit of Germany. Was Hitler contrary to the spirit of Germany? If so, why did he strike such a receptive chord in Germans? Or was he an expression of that spirit? Maccabee's Leo Baeck Institute is devoted to the principle that there is a spirit of Germany Jews can still love. Even today, he says, you've got German refugees who have a whole German Jewish culture still going outside Germany. The Leo Baeck Yearbook, of scholarly articles on German Jewish culture, is an expression of the love of Jews for Germany, and that's a very real thing. And then he returns to the culture he regards as far more responsible for the Holocaust than Germany. Germany's one thing. The Christian side of Germany is another thing. I don't blame Germany for the Holocaust. I blame Christendom for the Holocaust. Cynthia Ozick, an admirer of Maccabee's work, stressed to me her belief that Maccabee is not exculpating Germans, the German perpetrators, by blaming Christendom because the Holocaust was executed largely by German Christians. Still, it was interesting, two Jews, Steiner and Maccabee, going to great lengths to absolve Germany, if not Germans, from guilt. Two intellectuals who go to great lengths to shift responsibility from Hitler to great abstractions such as the blackmail of transcendence and Christendom. Why are so many so reluctant to find the obvious suspects guilty or at least responsible? In fact, the argument over the centrality of Hitler's responsibility and over the proportion of that responsibility shared by the German people as a whole is one of the most contentious and unresolved disputes in the whole field of Hitler explanation. One that, not long after my encounters with Steiner and Maccabee, turned into a bitter and divisive battle of scholars over the work of Daniel Goldhagen. Chapter 19. Daniel Goldhagen, Blaming Germans, in which we witness a scholarly wilding and explore explanation as revenge. By the time I had my first encounter with Daniel Jonah Goldhagen, the young scholar had already suffered much for his attempt to explain the Holocaust, and I did not wish to add to his distress. Although, as it turned out, judging from the abrupt way in which Goldhagen broke off our conversation about Hitler, I must have. Perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised at this development. I'd been witness to the first act of Goldhagen's ordeal about a month before we met, a wild and unruly symposium of scholars at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington that turned into an impromptu tribunal, with Goldhagen on trial. It became an unrelenting assault on his thesis and even his character that was shocking to many who witnessed it, almost akin to a scholarly wilding. The occasion was a 4-hour-long panel discussion of Goldhagen's just-published book, Hitler's Willing Executioners, in early April 1996, an event that attracted a capacity crowd to the museum's Meyerhoff Auditorium. More than capacity. There were long lines long before the doors opened, and considerable anxious pushing and shoving to secure seats. While there were scholars and academics in the audience, most appeared to be the kind of devoted admirers among the book-buying public who had just propelled Goldhagen's book onto the national bestseller lists, a rarity for a scholarly work. The book was an expansion of Goldhagen's doctoral thesis at Harvard. Many of them had brought copies hoping to get them autographed. Many crowded around him before and after the proceedings, remarking on his youth — he looked younger than his 35 years — on his dark-haired good looks. Few were prepared for what was to come, for the ferocity of the assault on Goldhagen by fellow scholars, a ferocity made all the more surprising and shocking by contrast with the almost unanimous acclaim by reviewers in the mainstream media who had hailed Hitler's Willing Executioners as an important new way of looking at the Holocaust. Yes, it was true there had been an uproar in the German press by some historians and intellectuals who accused Goldhagen of reinventing a demonic German national character to explain the Holocaust as an inevitable product of an intrinsically flawed Teutonic essence. But that night in the Holocaust Memorial Auditorium, Goldhagen's scholarly accusers were mainly fellow Jews. The first short, sharp, shocking hint at the tone of the proceedings that night came in the strangling reference. That the strangling allusion came from the evening's moderator, Lawrence Langer, made it all the more jolting. Langer is the author of a study of Holocaust literature and testimony I'd particularly admired because of its eloquently and scrupulously argued injunction against the consolation response, the tendency to take the horrifying raw material of Holocaust survivor testimonies and attempt to find in them glib, consoling morals about the triumph of the human spirit over adversity, the kitsch sentimentality the moralizers use to console themselves, a betrayal, Langer argues, of the inconsolable horror of those who underwent the actual experiences. Langer struck an ominous note in his opening remarks by calling upon the panelists to observe the canons of civility in their discussion, hinting there were those who thought the whole occasion ill-advised because passions ran too high and too deep to hope for civility. But it was Langer, too, who first signaled the tenor of the rhetorical violence to follow, when, after Goldhagen had run a few minutes over his allotted time for an opening statement, Langer not only upbraided the young scholar for his time-limit transgression, but indulged in a peculiar aside to the audience to the effect that when students in his college courses transgressed in that fashion, he often thought of strangling them. The pointed strangling fantasy, pointed at Goldhagen, brought an audible intake of breath from the audience. It seemed rather disproportionate to the nature of the offense. But, in fact, the image of strangling an impertinent, overzealous student might have inadvertently figured forth the true agenda of the evening. The attempt by some of his more senior colleagues to strangle Goldhagen's impertinent student's pretensions, if not the student himself, in the cradle. There was more direct abuse to follow, and afterward I wondered why Goldhagen provoked such an intemperate and seemingly disproportionate response from his older colleagues. Henry Kissinger once remarked that the reason academic infighting is so bitter is that the stakes are so small. But here I think it can fairly be said that, although professional jealousy over a younger scholar's sudden media stardom might have been a factor, the stakes, in fact, were not small. The stakes were very high. Goldhagen claimed to have explained the Holocaust, Hitler, the entire tragedy, in a way no one else had before, to have corrected errors, to have demolished myths unthinkingly accepted for generations. Implicit in his claims was his belief that if he was right, then the best and brightest scholars and thinkers before him were wrong. And what was it that made them wrong? What made Goldhagen's explanation so unique? At the heart of Goldhagen's argument is a single, striking, and strikingly graphic metaphor, in which can be found compressed the whole vision of his thesis. By the time Hitler came to power in 1933, he argues, the racial anti-Semitism of Germany was already pregnant with murder. It's a metaphor itself pregnant with implications. Murder, the mass murder of the Jews, had been gestating within Germany, meaning within the German people and their culture, long before Hitler emerged or the Nazi Party came to power. The conception of mass murder, the seeds of genocide, had been sown in the German psyche by centuries of hate literature of a peculiarly German variety, Goldhagen argues. He gives that strain of literature a name, eliminationist anti-Semitism. He defines it as a variety of Jew-hating that goes beyond the traditional Christian antagonism toward the people who were said to have rejected or killed Jesus, beyond the hatred Chaim Maccabee sees gestating for 18 centuries before bringing forth its murderous issue. No, Goldhagen says, a different kind of hatred superseded Christian anti-Semitism in Germany, one whose character crystallized in the 19th century, one characterized first by a focus on Jews as a racial and biological evil, and second by an insistence that no internal restrictions, but only total elimination, either expulsion or murder, could solve or cure the Jewish problem in Germany. It is this hatred that impregnated Germany, to use Goldhagen's metaphor, with murder, long before Hitler, that made Germans willing executioners of the final solution when they were given a chance by Hitler. Germans were thus not merely followers of orders, not colorless paper shufflers exhibiting Hannah Arendt's famous banality of evil, but rather viciously, joyously, cruelly, zealously willing torturers and murderers who did not need to be whipped into a frenzy by Hitler or Nazi propaganda. It wasn't Hitler's willingness to murder the Jews that was crucial, Goldhagen implies. It was Germans' willingness. If eliminationist anti-Semitism made Germany pregnant with murder long before Hitler stepped onto the public stage, pregnant at least since the 19th century, then Hitler is relegated to little more than a midwife role, there to assist the delivery, perhaps, to stretch the metaphor, to induce labor. But he's a facilitator of an irresistible force rather than a charismatic instigator and father of the murder being brought to birth. Germans did not need Hitler to prompt them to kill Jews. As one critic has characterized Goldhagen's thesis, Germans were already little Hitlers. As another, Columbia's Fritz Stern, who attacked Hitler's willing executioners as pretentious, shrill, and simplistic, put it, "For Goldhagen, as for the National Socialists, Hitler was Germany." The pregnant with murder metaphor challenges a number of influential Hitler and Holocaust explanations. It challenges Chaim Maccabee's view that 18 centuries of Christian anti-Semitism were more crucial than 19th century German anti-Semitism. It challenges the view of Hannah Arendt and her Epigenes that Germans were for the most part indifferent bureaucratic accomplices to a Hitler Nazi Party project. It challenges the fashionable contemporary academic attempt to look for the origin of the Holocaust in a deep-rooted Western racism, of which German Nazi anti-Semitism was merely a particularly virulent variety. More significant, Goldhagen's pregnant with murder metaphor implicitly challenges Milton Himmelfarb's influential no Hitler, no Holocaust formulation, an argument that the Holocaust didn't have to happen because of abstract historical forces, Christian anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism, German character, and the like. It would not have happened, it wasn't inevitable, Himmelfarb insists, had not one man, Hitler, wanted it to happen. The fact that Hitler wanted it is less important to Goldhagen than another causal element. Ordinary Germans wanted it. Hitler didn't have to talk them into killing Jews. He gave them the license they were longing for. The best, most original sections of Goldhagen's book are those devoted to a painstaking and painful-to-read account of the lesser-known modes of murder in the concentration camp universe, the obscenely euphemistic work battalions, instruments of murder whose operation displayed the joy the killers took in turning the killing process into merciless, slow torture. And the horrific death marches of late 1944 and 45, when some of the concentration camp guards packed up and took flight, with their prisoners, from advancing Russian troops, and despite the fact that the war was lost, zealously turned the retreat into a moving column of mass murder. His research does much to demolish the glib resort to sophisticated-sounding cliches about the banality of evil. The German killers, whose number, the number actively engaged in the execution process, Goldhagen places at over 500,000, were devoted and dedicated, far from the indifferent bureaucrats Arendt depicts. And yet it might seem puzzling at first, it was to me, that a book that argues that Germans hated Jews, really, really hated them and wanted to kill them, should be controversial to scholars, particularly Jewish scholars. In part, it was the packaging. A number of Goldhagen's attackers that evening referred to the book's boast to have solved a problem that had baffled previous scholars. In part, it was the book's implicit claim to have ended the debate over explanation. In fact, however, if the Holocaust can be traced to German eliminationist anti-Semitic literature, to the 19th century books and pamphlets that impregnated the nation with murder, then the process of explanation is not ended, but begun. Why were German people, why was German culture so receptive to the seeds of genocide? In addition, like all explanations that narrow their focus too sharply to a single point, the eliminationist anti-Semitism hypothesis inadvertently but implicitly tends to exculpate those factors it eliminates from primacy. Christian anti-Semitism, European cultural hostility to the Jews, the Nazi Party. which becomes, in this view, less the evil inciter and instigator of German hatred than the obedient servant of the evil wishes of an evilly conditioned German people. Even Hitler is, to an extent, exculpated. If Germany was pregnant with murder, that pregnancy was not his monstrous conception. He just brought the hot towels and boiling water to assist in its delivery. And yet, one was forced to wonder, when hearing the extreme, and at times extremely personal, attacks on Goldhagen that evening, whether it was not so much the Germanness of Goldhagen's theory, but its Goldhagenness that caused the furor. Because a persistent subtext of the attacks on his thesis were jabs at his lack of deference paid or credit given to previous scholars, at his claim to have refuted decades of misconceptions, to have overturned received wisdom, at the packaging of unremarkable ideas into mainstream marketability as some dazzling breakthrough reconception of the past. There were expressions of resentment at his book's instant bestsellerdom and the mainstream media coverage. There was resentment at a mere postdoctoral scholar suddenly thrusting himself into the center of a difficult conversation they'd been engaged in for decades, as if the youngest child at the Passover ceremony had decided not just to ask the traditional 4 questions, such as, why is this night different from all other nights, but to deliver the answers as if they'd never been answered correctly before. And so the strangling remark, while shocking when first uttered, was just a pale portent of what was to come. A slap compared to the thunderbolt hurled at Goldhagen from on high by the next speaker.